The microphone hit the studio floor with a metallic crash that echoed through the Family Feud set. Steve Harvey stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, staring at the father and son standing at the podium. In 30 years of television, he'd never heard an answer that stopped him cold like this. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone in that studio knew they were witnessing something far beyond entertainment. Carlos Hernandez, 45, stood next to his 18-year-old son Diego at the contestant podium. Carlos wore his only good shirt, a white button-down that he'd carefully ironed that morning in their tiny apartment. His hands, calloused from years of gripping violin strings, trembled slightly as he held the buzzer. Diego, tall and lean with his father's dark eyes, wore a suit jacket that was slightly too big for him, borrowed from his high school music teacher. The journey to this moment had begun 6 months earlier, when the Hernandez family received the call that changed everything. They'd been selected for Family Feud after applying on a whim during one of Diego's study breaks. Carlos had laughed when Diego suggested they apply, shaking his head at the impossibility of it all. But Diego had insisted, filling out the application while Carlos practiced violin in their small living room, preparing for another evening of playing on the corner of 5th and Broadway. For 15 years, Carlos had stood on that corner every evening after his day job at the warehouse. Rain or shine, summer heat or winter cold, he'd play his violin for the passing crowds. The worn case at his feet would slowly fill with dollars and quarters, tips from commuters who paused to listen to the haunting melodies that seemed to float above the city noise. Every dollar went toward the same dream, Diego's college education. The game had progressed normally until the 4th round. Steve was in his element, cracking jokes about the Martinez family's answers, keeping the energy high. The question seemed innocent enough. Name something a parent sacrifices for their child's future. Carlos had buzzed in confidently, his answer earning the number 2 spot on the board. Time, he'd said simply, and the audience had applauded politely. But it was Diego's turn that changed everything. Steve looked at the young man with genuine curiosity. Diego, same question. Name something a parent sacrifices for their child's future. Diego's eyes immediately found his father's. In that moment, the studio lights seemed to dim as something passed between them, an understanding born from years of shared struggle and unwavering love. Dreams, Diego answered, his voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for everyone to hear. A parent sacrifices their own dreams. Steve's reaction was immediate. His professional smile faded as he processed not just the answer, but the weight behind it. He looked at Carlos, whose eyes had filled with tears, then back at Diego, who was now openly crying. That's not on the board, son, Steve said gently, but his voice had lost all trace of game show energy. The studio audience had fallen completely silent, sensing that something profound was unfolding. Diego wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. My dad gave up his dream of playing in orchestras so he could play on street corners for my college money. Every night for 15 years, he stood outside in all weather, playing his heart out so I could have what he never could. The camera zoomed in on Carlos, who was no longer trying to hide his emotions. Diego, mi hijo, he whispered, his accent thick with tears. You are my dream. You always were my dream. That's when Steve Harvey did something unprecedented. He set his cards down on his podium and walked directly to the Hernandez family. The producers in the booth whispered frantically into their headsets, but the cameras kept rolling. Steve stopped in front of Carlos and Diego, looking back and forth between them. Carlos, Steve said, his voice stripped of all performance. Tell me about these street corners. Carlos struggled to compose himself. Every day after work, Senor Harvey, 5th and Broadway. Sometimes Washington Square when it's busy. I play classical music, some jazz, whatever people want to hear. Diego, he does his homework while I play, studying on the bench next to me. For how long? Steve asked. 15 years, Carlos replied. Since Diego was 3 years old. His mother, she died when he was young. So it's just us. I promised her I would give him everything. Everything she couldn't give him. Steve turned to Diego. And where are you going to college, son? Diego's voice was stronger now, filled with pride. Juilliard, Mr. Harvey. Full scholarship for violin performance. I learned by watching my father play on those corners. He taught me that music isn't about where you perform, it's about why you perform. The studio audience began to react, not with applause but with the kind of emotional sounds people make when they witness something deeply moving. Several people in the front row were openly crying. Steve looked around the studio, then back at the father and son. You know what? I need to stop this game right here. He turned to the opposing family. Martinez family. Would you mind if we took a moment? The Martinez patriarch immediately nodded. Of course, Steve. Whatever they need. Steve walked back to his podium, but instead of picking up his cards, he addressed the entire studio. Ladies and gentlemen, I want everyone to understand what we just witnessed. This young man just told us that his father gave up his dreams so he could chase his own. But what Diego doesn't realize is that his father didn't give up his dreams. He achieved the greatest dream of all. He raised a son who understood sacrifice, who valued family, who learned that love isn't what you say, it's what you do. Steve's voice grew stronger as he continued. Carlos, you've been performing every night for 15 years. Not on a stage, but on street corners where it matters more. Because real music, real art, real love, it doesn't need a concert hall. It just needs a heart willing to give everything. The audience rose to their feet, not because they were prompted to, but because they couldn't stay seated. The applause was thunderous, but it was more than applause. It was recognition, respect, and the kind of emotional release that comes when ordinary people witness extraordinary love. But Steve wasn't finished. He walked back to Carlos and Diego, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his personal business card and handed it to Diego. This has my personal number on it. When you graduate from Juilliard, you call me, because I want to be there when you perform your first concert. Then Steve did something that would become the defining moment of the episode. He began to remove his suit jacket, the same jacket he wore for every taping. He approached Carlos and gently placed it around the older man's shoulders. This jacket has been with me through every show I've hosted, Steve said. But tonight, it goes home with someone who understands what real performance looks like. Someone who knows that the greatest stage is the one where you sacrifice everything for someone you love. Carlos, wearing Steve's jacket that hung loosely on his smaller frame, reached out and embraced the host. It wasn't a quick television hug. It was the embrace of two fathers who understood each other completely. As confetti fell and the celebration music played, the Hernandez family had won more than 20,000. They'd won something infinitely more valuable, recognition that their story mattered, that their love was seen, and that 15 years of street corner performances had been worth every note. The episode became legendary not for the game, but for the moment when entertainment became testimony. When a game show stage became a place where the most important performances happened not for cameras but for family. What the cameras didn't capture was what happened after the taping ended. As the audience filed out and the crew began breaking down the set, Steve found Carlos and Diego in the green room. Carlos was carefully folding Steve's jacket, treating it like the precious gift it was. "Keep it on," Steve said quietly, sitting down across from them. "I meant what I said out there. That jacket has been with me through everything. Now it's going to be with someone who deserves it more than I ever did." Diego looked at his father, then at Steve. "Mr. Harvey, there's something else. Tomorrow is my father's birthday. He's turning 46. For 15 years, he's never taken a day off from playing on that corner. Not once, not even on his birthday." Steve's expression softened even further. "What does he do on his birthday?" "He plays longer," Diego said, his voice breaking again. "He says birthdays are for making more music, more money for my future. Last year he played for 12 hours straight." People kept giving him tips because they could hear something different in his music that day. Carlos reached over and took his son's hand. Every birthday is a gift, because I get another year to watch you grow, another year to save for your dreams. Steve stood up slowly, walked to the window, overlooking the Los Angeles skyline. After a long moment, he turned back to them. Carlos, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. What's your birthday wish this year? Carlos was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. To hear Diego play at Carnegie Hall someday. To sit in the audience like a regular father and watch my son perform on the stage I could never reach. Done, Steve said simply. Senor Harvey, I'm going to make some calls. And next year, on your 47th birthday, you're going to be sitting in Carnegie Hall watching Diego perform. That's not just my promise to you. That's my promise to your wife's memory, to every father who's ever stood on a street corner chasing his child's dreams. Diego stood up so quickly, his chair fell over. Mr. Harvey, Carnegie Hall doesn't just let anyone perform there. I'm still a student. I'm nobody special. Steve smiled for the first time since the taping had ended. Son, after tonight, after millions of people see what sacrifice looks like, after they understand what real music means, you won't be nobody. You'll be exactly who you've always been, your father's greatest composition. 3 months later, when the episode aired, it broke every ratings record in Family Feud history. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from viewers who wanted to support Carlos and Diego. A GoFundMe page raised over $200,000 for Diego's education expenses. But more than that, street musicians across the country reported increased tips and recognition. People had learned to really listen. Carlos returned to his corner at 5th and Broadway, the day after the taping, wearing Steve's jacket. He played with a different kind of confidence now, knowing that his story had been heard, that his sacrifice had been honored. When passers-by recognized him from television, they didn't just drop coins in his case. They stopped to listen, really listen, to the music of a father's love. Diego continued his studies, but every evening after classes, he joined his father on that corner. 2 violins instead of 1. Father and son making music together, under the city lights. They played the same songs, but somehow they sounded different now. They sounded like hope. They sounded like dreams being passed from one generation to the next. And Steve Harvey. He learned that sometimes the most powerful moments happen not when you follow the script, but when you throw it away and follow your heart. The jacket he'd given away was replaced, but the lesson Carlos and Diego taught him remained. That the greatest performances happen not on stages, but in the everyday moments, when love chooses sacrifice, when fathers choose their children's dreams over their own, and when music becomes a language that speaks louder than words. The corner of 5th and Broadway became something of a pilgrimage site for Family Feud fans. They came to hear Carlos play, to drop money in his case, to witness firsthand the kind of love that stops television shows and changes hearts. Because Carlos never stopped playing, never stopped believing, never stopped proving that some dreams are bigger than the dreamer, and some love is stronger than any stage could ever hold.